related to instructional excuse me, related to instructional practice will be enhanced by the involvement and the support of instructional leadership. But as leaders, you have a lot on your plate, and there are likely many initiatives simultaneously vying for your attention. So we'd like to begin by sharing with you a rationale for why formative assessment should be one of those initiatives that has moved to the top of your list and really becomes a school-wide focus. On this slide, you'll see a definition that some of you are likely becoming quite familiar with. The definition that we're using of the formative assessment process in Maryland. It comes from the Council of Chief State School Officers. And we've highlighted a few keywords that emphasize what is so important about this definition of formative assessment as a process between teachers and students, as something that occurs during instruction, that's rooted in feedback and used to adjust teaching and learning in an ongoing way. In FAME, we highlight key instructional practices like clear learning goals, descriptive feedback, and peer assessment that, when integrated and used as a regular part of instruction, lead to really powerful shifts in classroom culture. On our webinar back in April, which was titled The Role of the Student, we showed several videos of formative assessment classrooms and asked the participants to respond about what they noticed. And so the comments that you see on this slide were selected from that feedback in the chat log. And they describe what this kind of teaching and learning looks like and why we think it's so exciting. Many of those participants picked up on the idea in formative assessment that the role of the teacher and the student is significantly different. The formative assessment instructional practices, when in place and used intentionally, help students better understand what they are learning, why it's important to learn, and what they, the student, can do to take their own next steps. What we think these quotes illustrate so well is that formative assessment addresses and supports the core of teaching and learning. By giving teachers the tools and the knowledge they need to better understand where students are in their learning and how to use that evidence to guide instruction, we find that the pace of learning can increase and that students become more engaged in the learning process. Because of its strong focus on supporting teachers to improve instruction, formative assessment also complements and enhances other key initiatives. So, for example, the formative assessment process requires teachers to really dig into their content standards to identify learning goals and success criteria and develop learning progressions. And so this dovetails nicely with work that you might be doing to transition to the Maryland College and Career Ready Standards, for example, or with its emphasis on short cycle, low stakes assessment. Formative assessment can help teachers do progress monitoring for their student learning objectives. Finally, the classroom assessment practices promoted in FAME align with the Charlotte Danielson framework for effective teaching that many districts are using as part of their educator evaluation process. We also think it's important to emphasize that the assessment process featured in the FAME program is quite comprehensive, and it includes a variety of instructional practices that have been shown in research to have a positive impact on student achievement, including teacher clarity about learning goals and success criteria, the use of feedback, metacognition, and student self and peer assessment. And you can see, well, you can sort of see, looks like the formatting got a little messed up here, but hopefully you can still see that in Hattie's meta-analysis, each of these was found to have a large effect size. Hattie explains that anything over a 0.4 effect is considered greater than the effect of an average teacher on student learning. So to take a look at one of these practices in particular, the use of descriptive feedback that's focused on the learning goal has an effect size of 0.73. And this one is interesting because the research also shows that if feedback is not effective, so if it involves the student ego, so for example, something along the lines of you didn't work hard enough, or it's not specific enough, so the teacher just says something like, great work, it can actually be harmful to students' learning. So understanding how to use these instructional practices well is an important part of the FAME work. We also think it's quite striking to compare the impact of these practices that are part of the formative assessment process with other initiatives, those that are shown below the line, like smaller class size and the use of ability grouping, where there's been significant policy focus and in many cases significant funding that actually have a much smaller effect on student learning overall. Finally, many educators feel that there has been too much of a focus in recent years on external high-stakes testing. That type of assessment certainly has a purpose, but it's not to support individual students' learning. In Knowing What Students Know, which is a highly regarded research analysis focused on the use of assessment and learning, a case is made for shifting the balance from what they describe as a disproportionate emphasis on external assessment to an increased emphasis on classroom formative assessment. A shift from what's sometimes called assessment of learning to assessment for learning. And this kind of assessment allows both teachers and students to focus on what students know, as in the title of this book. So we wanted to give an example of what this looks like, and we selected a video from a classroom in the UK where there has been more of a focus on assessment for learning in recent years. And we hesitated because we recognize that this is an early elementary classroom and that it can sometimes be hard for educators to see themselves in an example that's not close to their own grade level. But ultimately, we decided to share this video because we feel like the practices that the teacher is illustrating can be employed at any grade level with some adjustments. So as you watch the video in just a moment, we'd like for you to think about first what you see the teacher doing to understand what her students know, what strategies is she using. And secondly, if you come from a secondary background, you might also think about what this could look like in your context. So it looks like we might have an issue with the video. I'm going to ask Casey to try to play it again. Okay, so hopefully we'll be able to solve that issue and maybe show you the video in a moment. Take two.
The silver bullet.
Okay, thank you. So we know that on any webinar we're going to have at least one technical difficulty, so hopefully we got that out of the way. Thanks for your patience with that. I'm left wondering if parents in the UK find American children's accents as adorable and charming as I find their children's. So we know that this is just a short clip, but we think that it represents quite a big shift in the culture of assessment to one which, as I said before, emphasizes what students do know, which can be in contrast to how we often think about and use assessments in US classrooms when we focus on what students don't know. So we'll ask you again to think about what you saw the teacher doing to understand what her students knew and could do. And so you're welcome to enter your response or your thoughts and observations into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can open the line and have you respond aloud. And I had also asked you to think about what this might look like in a secondary classroom. And so some of my thoughts on that question were that you might see a larger class size, for example, and you potentially could see students slightly more reluctant to use resources they need if they are different from their peers. But I think you could imagine a secondary teacher using a performance task in a similar manner, making observations and asking questions about how students approached and solved the problem. So we are getting some responses in the chat. Again, I apologize that some people may have had trouble with the video, but Crystal typed in that she's having the students pick the resources that they need, and then also, I'm sorry, that was Cynthia, and also that they are showing their work and explaining their results. Let's see. Right, some students were kind of doing the math in their head, but she asked them to use the resources that they needed and show their thinking. Great, thank you. So you can continue to add those to the chat because we like to have a record of this later and to spend a little bit more time looking at them. Just a few things that I hope that you did notice. First, you can think of this activity as a type of performance task, and it doesn't really feel like an assessment. It's kind of a natural event in the classroom, and as a result, it should be a pretty low anxiety experience for students. And as some of you mentioned, the teacher is observing closely not only their answer, but how they solve the problem. So as George was saying, explaining why and showing their thinking, making that visible. She also intentionally let them choose the resources they needed, and that was an additional piece of information for her about what stage they were at in their learning and what they needed. So she asked them to explain what they did and why they did it. So thank you very much. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sue.
Good afternoon, everybody. We've spoken quite a bit now about some key shifts that occur in classrooms focused on formative assessment. The shift in students' role on assessment, for example, or the shift in the teachers and the leaders' focus toward what students know rather than what they don't know. And we've highlighted some of the research that illustrates the impact of key formative assessment practices, such as clearly specifying students' learning goals and providing specific feedback on sorry, I just lost my train of thought. My phone went off. Students' progress in relation to those learning goals. So hopefully we've convinced or reaffirmed your belief that this is a worthwhile area to invest your leadership energies. When we designed this program, we had some operating assumptions from the start about the role of instructional leaders in this work. We believed and we noticed across schools that when instructional leaders, broadly speaking here, are actively involved, they achieve much stronger results. But what do you have to do and what do you have to know as an instructional leader to support implementation? Well, a convergence of decades of research suggests that specific leadership actions make a difference. In this video, Doug Reeves argues that we know what works in professional development, we just need to be more deliberate in applying it. He highlights findings from Marzano, Waters, and McNulty's 2005 meta-analysis that identified 21 leadership behaviors that are related to students' achievement. But he warns us that it's not one leadership behavior, but it's the effective integration of these behaviors that really makes a difference for students. More specifically, he emphasizes the importance of focusing on only a few areas of improvement that will have the greatest impact for students' achievement, and then studying these deeply and consistently. This allows a school to move beyond superficial implementation to consider how best to apply new skills and knowledge, to examine students' responses and progress in relation to these efforts, and to make important adjustments and refinements over time to achieve desired results for students. As you watch this video, consider how various school leaders, that may mean the principal or curriculum specialist, department heads, teacher or team leaders, basically everybody in the room here on this webinar, can support improved focus and better depth in teachers' professional learning. Listen for these ideas as we go through the video and the webinar, and consider how to apply these in your own local context. Let's see if this video kicks off for us all right.
Beware the silver bullet. Beware of anybody who says that a cause for an effect. What our latest research using factor analysis suggests is
well, we lost the end of that video, but we can echo Doug Reeves' comments that narrow, concise, consistent, and deep focus on improvement efforts is really critical. Studies suggest that the principal in particular plays an important role, particularly in conveying the core values and the expectations of any instructional initiative, and helping us to set the tone and direction for professional learning. For example, We know that when principals model risk-taking and acknowledge and take action from their mistakes, teachers are also more likely to take risks and try new approaches with their students and to make revisions and refinements over time. We also know that when principals not only promote learning about curriculum and instruction, but participate in that learning right alongside teachers, that their role of lead learner conveys important messages to teachers and students. These principles orient team learning towards school-wide goals, convey expectations that teachers collaborate to make meaningful data-informed decisions, and they steer teachers away from inappropriate or superficial uses of data. But we also know that instructional leadership involves a range of others beyond just the principal. Other administrators, curriculum specialists, instructional coaches, department heads, teacher leaders, all of you play a significant role in focusing the school on that limited set of high-priority instructional goals and sustaining that focus despite the range of other tasks and demands that inevitably come knocking on the school's door. In concert, this complement of school leaders helps to guard the school's instructional focus and provides thoughtful ongoing guidance to teachers about how school-wide initiatives and interventions will affect curriculum, instruction, and assessment. They monitor teachers' progress as well as students' related achievement, and they help to monitor alignment between the expectations in teachers' classrooms and the high expectations of the school. The research on change leadership is very clear that sustainable change takes at least 3 to 5 years. As represented here by Fixen's implementation model, there are stages of change that we can anticipate. And we do know quite a bit from what we've seen in our own practice and from research about what kinds of leadership practices seem to work at different stages along this change process. As I briefly describe these stages, think about the leadership strategies that have helped your school move on to each new stage here, as well as where along the way your school gets hung up in the implementation process when you take on new initiatives. We've organized the FAME leadership work to help you manage and lead successfully across each stage because leadership strategies need to shift over time in tandem with teachers developing competencies. For example, during this exploration stage, when teachers will likely ask, why do we need to do this? What does this have to do with me? School leaders can anticipate teachers need to learn about where they're headed and why new practices might better serve students than their current practices. This is a good time to engage the faculty in shared readings, observations of other sites where these practices are really well developed, and based on these activities to begin to develop a common language in relation to the improvement effort. School leaders might also inventory current practices in the building and marshal resources, including time for collaboration, to ensure relevant supports for teachers as they move forward. During the installation stage, we can anticipate that teachers will ask, wait, aren't we already doing this? And that instructional leaders will need to outline how new practices are differentiated from or reach beyond current practices. They may need to talk individually with teachers to convey expectations and acknowledge teachers' worries or concerns about adopting new practices while at the same time encouraging enthusiastic early adopters. In initial implementation, teachers will begin to ask, what will this look like in my classroom? How's this going to affect my practice? And when they try on new practices, they'll be concerned with whether they're implementing practices correctly or in, quote, the right way. At this stage, it's important for leaders to have a sense of what's happening in and across classrooms in the school to provide reassurance to teachers and to offer opportunities for teachers to receive informal supportive feedback as they try new practices. This is a good time for leaders to coordinate scheduling to enable teachers to discuss and share their strategies across grades or subjects and to strategize how to address the challenges that they're experiencing. During this next stage, teachers are likely to ask, have we fully integrated this new work into our practice? How consistently is this going on across the school? And how's our school culture shifting as a result? Because teachers are now attempting to change their instructional approaches in really substantive ways, they're likely to recognize that their students' role in learning is also shifting. School leaders have a really important role at this stage in facilitating deep inquiry and dialogue among teachers as they work to reconceptualize teachers' and students' roles in the work. Teachers will benefit from tools such as well-articulated rubrics, clear and specific instructional feedback to help gauge their progress, and celebrations of their success. School leaders will also need to cycle back around to clarify expectations for full implementation and to identify and use internal experts to provide guidance and support to those who are still developing their practice. It's also a good time to find opportunities for people to share their knowledge and skills in new ways, whether through peer observations or presentations to the parent community. Excuse me. During the innovation stage, after teachers have developed some fluency with new practices, leaders need to focus on encouraging the expertise and authority of teachers to make sound and justified modifications to practice, while also holding true to the expectations that have been laid out for the initiative. Leaders ensure teachers use data appropriately to inform their decisions, and they expect teachers to monitor students' progress and determine whether these innovations are having the intended impact on students' learning. And finally, when a school moves towards sustainability, leaders need to attend to mechanisms that embed new practices in the ongoing work of the school. A key question during this stage is whether new practices are now part of the school's culture. And further, what will it take to sustain these as the school begins to shift its focus to other improvement initiatives? Because innovative practices don't fare well in pre-existing structures designed for other purposes, leaders may need to work with the faculty to take on things such as redesigning grading practices or formalizing new classroom observation protocols or stabilizing community of practice routines. This is also a stage where leaders can encourage teachers to consolidate and articulate what they've learned and to share this out with others beyond the school as a means for acknowledging well-earned expertise and success. So let's just take a minute now. On the next slide, Casey. Thank you. To consider FICSAN's implementation model in relation to your own leadership challenges. Think of some recent initiatives that you or your school have undertaken. Maybe you've adopted a new curriculum program, or you're using student learning objectives, or you're focused on some priority like beefing up higher order thinking skills in the classroom. Would you take just a second and think about how far along this continuum you usually get? And using the polling feature, just indicate the stage where you think you or your school have often gotten hung up when trying on new implementation efforts. Again, the polling feature is up at the top there with a little square with the A under it. You can select your response, A, B, C, D, or E, up to the innovation stage we went. See a number of people indicate that they often get hung up at the full implementation stage. We'll give just a second longer for others to think about where do your initiatives at your school typically get stalled. You see some real common trends here where people get now up to the full implementation phase and it never gets to be fully sustained. So on the next slide, would you take a minute and just use the chat box? We're interested in hearing now about the strategies or supports that you feel have helped your school to move beyond that phase, or you think would have made a difference at the time if you could have had your druthers. What would have helped you move past full implementation to get to that innovation stage? I see a number of people chatting in. I'm going to let you chat for a minute. I'm going to continue on and then cycle back to what you're entering. It's interesting that you all noted full implementation as a problematic point to get beyond, because about 15 years ago, federal and state money for new initiatives was provided to schools and districts really for about 1 year's time, and we learned that this did not work. So now we see more funding that includes planning years and longer implementation support lasting 3, 4, and sometimes 5 years, in recognition that it takes much longer. School leaders used to get stuck in the early stages of implementation, but now they're more often stuck right where you said, in the full implementation stage. But if you don't keep going, if you lose your resources, your commitment, your energy, we know these efforts just won't hold and become sustainable in the school. The greatest challenge for many school leaders is in making an initiative their own and sustaining the practice. This is the focus of the FAME leadership training this summer. This idea of how do you see an initiative through all the way to sustainability. So we see in your comments that you have competing needs come to the door that often interrupt your focus on an initiative. Too many things taken on at one time, switching to different professional development orientations. This is one of the key roles of leaders, is to really protect the focus and to keep the focus, the school's focus, narrow and going deep. Cynthia writes, a part of the issue is the district sticking with the program. Often it changes from year to year depending on the leadership, and that's why it becomes really important for there to be multiple leaders helping to move the work and not having it be too reliant on a single leader. So this seems to be the biggest hurdle, is sustaining the focus continuously over time and going deep, as Doug Reeves was referencing. Thank you for sharing your experiences. It seems quite consistent. So we've thought through a lot of these leadership challenges and provide important supports in the FAME design to help leaders really learn how to sustain this work until formative assessment practices are well established and embedded in the culture of the school. This is one segment on this slide from a longer document that identifies and describes some of the change work that leaders in the field have pursued at different stages. In this segment, in the left-hand columns, we see the estimated time frame for this one stage. This is just the exploration stage, and the key questions that teachers are likely to ask during this stage. And then over to the right, we see description of both general leadership practices that attend to these questions, as well as very specific strategies that are appropriate during the stage for formative assessment implementation in particular. The key takeaway here is that leadership tasks shift in relation to the implementation stage, something that we really dig into during the summer leadership training. Basically, there aren't any shortcuts. If you tackle this work, you need to support this over the long haul and see it through. This is how you'll see the power of the formative assessment work. This requires focusing teachers on deep content work up front, such as clarifying student learning goals and developing understanding of how students' learning progresses in each domain. And leaders need to frame this upfront work for teachers and help them see the long view and the expected return of their efforts for students' learning. Moss, Burkhart, and Long's research helps to synthesize these leadership strategies by identifying and describing 3 overarching principles that guide leaders who are successful with formative assessment work.
Hi, so as Sue mentioned, we're kind of switching from thinking about instructional leadership in general to what we know works for instructional leadership with formative assessment. And we're looking to Moss, Burkhart, and Long to kind of guide our thinking around this. So first, what they tell us is that leaders need to understand the key components of formative assessment, not just conceptually, but what they actually look like in classroom practice. Once they know what to look for, school leaders have to learn to focus classroom observations more on what the students are doing rather than what teachers are doing. And finally, to lead formative assessment, leaders need to demonstrate that they are also learners. Many of you feel very comfortable in this role and are accustomed to learning alongside or just ahead of your teachers, but others may find this a little less comfortable. Fortunately, no matter where you are in your knowledge of formative assessment, there is always more to learn. So something that I often said when I was doing this work in Rhode Island was that this is something you cannot get too good at. You are really never done with this work. So let's dig into each of these ideas a bit more. The research tells us that it's important for school leaders to understand formative assessment well, but our own experience and the experience of my colleagues in Rhode Island confirm this to be true. So the first quote that you see is from my friend Jim, who is an excellent superintendent in Rhode Island, and he really led the charge around formative assessment in his district. And when I asked him a few weeks ago, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you started this work? He said that he wrongly assumed that his administrators knew the content. And he found that without that solid understanding, it was very difficult for them to push teachers' thinking about their own practice. And that rang true for me, stuck with me, because it makes sense that if you don't deeply understand something, it is quite difficult to push someone else's thinking about it. And if we don't push each other's thinking and push each other's practice, we won't see the kind of meaningful change that we're hoping for. And then the very next day, I actually had an opportunity to speak to another friend of mine, Nancy, who works as a curriculum director in Rhode Island, and she had a similar takeaway. She told me that when she rolled this work out in her district, many people told her, we do this already, which kind of harkens back to one of the stages that Sue was talking about. And it wasn't until she herself deepened her own understanding that she could see the difference between sporadically using an exit ticket and formative assessment that was part of regular practice, and that at that point she could push back and say, no, we're not doing this as well as we could be. The second thing that Moss, Brookhart, and Long tell us is that leaders should shift their focus from what the teachers are doing in the classroom to what students are doing. And to the extent possible, leaders should get into classrooms and just ask students, what are you working on? Why? Ask them if they know how they're doing in this class and how they know that. And paying attention to who's doing the cognitive lifting during instruction. We couldn't find a video that showed this exactly in action, but we have a follow-up to the video that you saw earlier, which hopefully will work more smoothly, in which the coach who was observing the lesson is reviewing the footage with the teacher and having a conversation with her about what students were doing. So let's go ahead and play that video now. All right, great, thanks. So you can see that while the coach's approach in this video is quite soft, the teacher can articulate what she was doing and what the students were doing and why. So she has a clear sense of the purpose of the activity and what information she was trying to get out of it. So in this case, the coach perhaps did not have to press very hard to get the information, but in doing the observation and having the conversation and asking those reflective questions, she sends a message that, one, it's important to be clear about your purpose and what you're looking for, and that, two, she also is paying attention to the role and the actions and the words of the students in the classroom. So early on in implementation, this might be where you as a leader focus on asking teachers to reflect, on asking questions about what students are doing and why. And the last idea presented by Moss, Brookhart, and Long is that leaders should play the role of lead learner. In the FAME program, we've embedded several opportunities for leaders to take on that role and develop the knowledge and skills to deepen formative assessment in their schools over time. By taking on this way of working as lead learner, building leaders can model the kinds of changes they expect to see in a formative classroom, where teachers establish expectations for learning, but allow students a variety of ways to figure out how to reach those learning goals. So in the same way, in the same program, leaders will set expectations for learning and then find various ways to support teachers as they adopt and refine those practices. So to begin, we can consider what leaders can be doing now prior to the launch of the program. So as we mentioned earlier, if you haven't joined us for the earlier webinars in the series, you can access them on MSDE's Blackboard site, and these will start to familiarize you with the content and the program design to give you some ideas for how to select facilitators and how to structure your community of practice. And there are also a number of additional resources on the MSDE webpage that we encourage you to review. Come summer, you'll have the opportunity to go much deeper with this content in one of our summer leadership trainings. So these are two-day orientations that will be held regionally during the last 2 weeks of July, and they're designed to help leaders explore key elements of formative assessment practice, to identify and address school-wide issues related to the adoption of these practices, to plan for strategies to align this work with other initiatives, and to establish building-wide learning goals. We intend for these sessions to be very hands-on and connected to your own context, and so we'll provide opportunities for you to align this work with your school improvement plan or your PD plan, for example. And for this reason, we think it's very important for each school to be represented by at least a team of 2 in those leadership trainings, so that everybody has a thought partner who can help them problem solve and plan. Come fall, when the initiative launches for teachers, we'll begin a series of follow-up supports. So each month there will be an online convening during which school leaders involved in the work will be invited to come together to learn and collaborate around a topic that aligns with what is likely surfacing for teachers at that stage of implementation. These sessions will focus on practice and learning from other leaders in similar roles around the state. And between these monthly convenings, we'll provide you with suggested activities that you can complete as your schedule permits throughout the month, including checking in with participants on their progress and challenges, or perhaps conducting informal observations. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of resources that we've developed and will make available to you. I want to highlight just 2 of them here. One is the document that Sue referenced earlier, which anticipates the range of challenges that come up at each stage of implementation and provides some guidance about what leaders can do to support teachers at that stage. And the second is a continuum of practice. Actually, if you could just switch back just for a moment so you can see that describes 3 levels of practice: developing, improving, and exemplary, for each key element of the formative assessment practice highlighted in the course. So this document can be used to help leaders reflect on current and evolving teacher practices and help teachers consider their own next steps. It's set up sort of like a learning progression, so it documents what you might observe teachers doing well at each stage of their development, aligned to those 5 CCSSO formative assessment attributes. During the summer leadership training, we'll provide many additional tools, templates, and resources to support you. Okay, thank you. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Denise to wrap it up.
Okay, hi. So just a couple of things. If you are a school leader and you're thinking about how this will align with your school needs and what may work for you as you begin to think through participating in the professional learning, we encourage you to go and speak with maybe some of your other administrators or teacher in your building to gauge interest and see if you yourself in your school has time to commit. If you're a teacher and you are interested in what you heard here today and your school has not registered yet, we encourage you to go ahead and talk to your administrator and determine if as a school you can make the commitment to this work and a focus as you begin the school year next year. And can you find others in your building who would like to participate as well? Melissa Finkel, my colleague, has copied in the chat box the link that goes to our MSDE FAME blog spot. And here you can find all the resources that Laura was just speaking about. You can find all our past archived webinars. So any of our past webinars that we've had that may give you more specific information about the implementation and how the professional learning might look next year can all be found on our blog spot, along with our registration. And I'll just go ahead and show you quickly a screenshot of the blog, and you can see that you'll also find the dates for the Summer Leadership Institute that we will be having in the 4 regions. And the dates. The times will be 8:30 to 3:30. So as you go onto this page, I encourage you to go to the registration page. We're asking schools to register as a team, so principals would or leaders, school leaders would go ahead and register the school in one registration. I think that is it for right now as far as information that we have to give to you. Melissa has also copied in the chat box. This Thursday, we're going to be hosting a question and answer session. We're not going to be giving any new information as far as content, but really any questions you have specifically about how MSDE can support you, what this might look like in your school, how the actual professional learning is going to occur. We encourage you to to go to our blog. The link will be there, and it's, again, this Thursday from 4 to 4:30. So if you have questions right now, I'll be happy to stick around and answer them. Or if you want to take some time to think and you have time on Thursday to meet with us between 4 and 4:30, we'll also be available for your questions. So if you have questions, feel free. You can use your mic, or you can go ahead in the chat box. Okay, it looks like we don't have any questions right now, but again, this Thursday from 4 to 4:30, anyone you'd like to invite to join you from your district or your school, please feel free to talk to us then. Or if you'd like to email us, our emails are, I'll put our emails up for you, and you can feel free to email any one of us with specific questions. We'll be happy to come and talk to your school, administrators, faculty, whatever we can do to support you. Okay. And one last thing, here is another link for a feedback of the webinar. If you could use the link to go to SurveyMonkey and give us some feedback about this webinar, we would appreciate it. And we look forward to talking with you on Thursday. And thank you very much.